Friday, October 14, 1949, 3:30 p.m. Marcus Johnson walked out of DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx carrying 3 textbooks and a dream. He was 14 years old, skinny for his age, wore glasses that were too big for his face, and had just gotten the highest score in his English class on the Shakespeare exam. Mrs. Hayes had written, "Exceptional work, Marcus. Keep this up and you'll have your pick of universities," in red ink at the top of his essay. Marcus folded the paper carefully, put it in his notebook, and started the walk to the subway station. He had to get home to Harlem, help his mother with dinner, then study for Monday's geometry test. He never made it to the subway. They were waiting for him 3 blocks from the school. 8 white teenagers from Hell's Kitchen, Irish kids who took the train up to the Bronx every day because their neighborhood school was overcrowded. They'd noticed Marcus 2 weeks ago when school started, noticed the way teachers praised him, noticed how he always had the right answer, noticed that he was one of only 4 black students in a school of 1,500, and they'd decided to do something about it. Tommy Sullivan was the leader, 17 years old, red hair, freckles, fists like hammers from working on the docks with his father. He stepped out of an alley with 7 of his friends forming a semicircle blocking Marcus's path. "Hey, bookworm," Tommy said, his Irish accent thick. "Where you goin' in such a hurry?" Marcus knew immediately this was trouble. He'd lived in Harlem all his life, had been taught by his mother and his Uncle Bumpy how to recognize danger. He stopped walking, gripped his books tighter, looked for an escape route. The street was empty. Everyone else had already gone home or taken different routes. "I'm just heading home," Marcus said quietly. "Keep your voice steady," his uncle had taught him. "Don't show fear. Don't give them a reason." "Home to Harlem?" Tommy asked. "That's where you belong, right? Not here. Not in our school." "It's not your school," Marcus said before he could stop himself. "It's everyone's school." That was the wrong thing to say. Tommy's face went red. "You gettin' smart with me, Negro? You think because you get good grades you're better than us?" "Pick it up," Tommy said. Marcus bent down to get his book. That's when they started kicking. The first boot caught him in the ribs. The second hit his shoulder. Marcus tried to protect his head, curled into a ball like his uncle had taught him. But there were 8 of them and 1 of him. They kicked him in the back, the legs, the arms. Someone stomped on his hand. Marcus heard his fingers crack. Someone else kicked his glasses off his face. He heard them crunch under a boot. "This is what happens when you don't know your place," Tommy was shouting. "You tell all your colored friends, this school ain't for you." They kicked him for maybe 30 seconds. It felt like hours. Then someone yelled, "Cops!" and they ran. Scattered in different directions, like roaches when the lights come on. Marcus lay on the sidewalk, pain everywhere, tasting blood from where his lip had split. His glasses were destroyed. His books were scattered across the street. His right hand was swelling, fingers bent at wrong angles. He tried to stand, couldn't. The world was spinning. A woman found him 10 minutes later. Mrs. Chen ran a laundry on the corner. She called an ambulance, called the police, stayed with Marcus until help arrived. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness. He kept thinking about his essay, the one Mrs. Hayes had brazed. It was still in his notebook, now lying in a puddle, the red ink running in the water. Exceptional work, Marcus. He'd wanted to show it to his uncle, wanted to make Uncle Bumpy proud. The ambulance took him to Harlem Hospital. They'd wanted to take him to Fordham Hospital in the Bronx, but Mrs. Chen insisted. He's from Harlem. Take him to his own hospital. His people will want to know. By the time they got Marcus into the emergency room, it was 4:15 p.m. His mother, Margaret, was at work, cleaning houses on the Upper East Side. His Uncle Bumpy was at Wells' restaurant, having a late lunch with some associates. Nobody knew yet that Marcus had been beaten half to death 3 blocks from his school. At 5:17 p.m., a nurse at Harlem Hospital made a phone call. She knew who Marcus's uncle was. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson, and she knew that when something happened to Bumpy's family, Bumpy needed to know immediately. Illinois Gordon answered the phone at Wells' restaurant. "This is Harlem Hospital. We have Marcus Johnson in the emergency room. He's been beaten. We need to notify his family." Illinois felt his blood turn to ice. How bad? Bad enough. Broken ribs, broken fingers, possible concussion. He'll live, but he's hurt. Illinois walked to the table where Bumpy was sitting with 3 Harlem businessmen, discussing a loan for a new grocery store. He leaned down, whispered in Bumpy's ear. Bumpy's face didn't change expression. He stood up calmly, excused himself from the table, walked to the phone. "This is Bumpy Johnson. You called about my nephew." The nurse gave him the details. Beaten by multiple assailants. Found on the street near his school. Injuries consistent with being kicked repeatedly. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. Did he say who did it? They arrived at Harlem Hospital at 5:35. Marcus was in a bed in the emergency ward, his face swollen, right hand in a temporary splint, breathing shallow from the broken ribs. Bumpy stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at his nephew. This boy who loved books more than basketball, who wanted to be a lawyer someday, who'd just gotten a letter 2 weeks ago from Columbia University offering him a full scholarship if he kept his grades up for the next 4 years. This brilliant, gentle kid who'd never hurt anyone in his life, beaten like a dog on the street. Bumpy walked to the bed, sat down in the chair next to it, took Marcus's left hand gently, the one that wasn't broken. "Marcus, it's Uncle Bumpy. Can you hear me?" Marcus's eyes fluttered open. He tried to smile, winced from the split lip. "Uncle Bumpy, I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" "I lost my glasses, and my geometry book is ruined. I know they cost money." Bumpy felt something break inside his chest. His nephew was apologizing for losing his glasses while lying in a hospital bed. "Don't worry about the glasses. Don't worry about the books. Just tell me what happened." Marcus told him. The 8 Irish teenagers. Tommy Sullivan's name. The kicks, the insults, the "you don't belong here" hatred. Bumpy listened without interrupting, his face showing nothing, but his free hand gripping the armrest of the chair so hard his knuckles went white. When Marcus finished, he looked at his uncle with scared eyes. "Uncle Bumpy, are you going to hurt them? Because if you do, they'll expel me from school. They'll say my family are criminals and I can't come back." Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. He thought about what he usually did to people who hurt his family, the things he'd done to protect Harlem over the years, the violence, the retribution, the message-sending that kept his people safe. But looking at Marcus's face, at this boy who wanted to be a lawyer, who believed in books and education, and doing things the right way, Bumpy made a decision. "I'm not going to hurt them, Marcus. I promise you that." "You're not?" Marcus looked confused. His uncle always protected family. Everyone knew that. Margaret arrived at 6 o'clock, having rushed from the Upper East Side the moment the hospital called her employer. She saw her son's face and started crying. Bumpy stood, hugged his sister, let her cry into his shoulder. "I'm going to fix this, Margaret. I swear to God I'm going to fix this." "Bumpy, don't do anything that'll make it worse. Don't give them a reason to say we're what they think we are." "I won't. Trust me." That night, Bumpy sat in his office above Wells' restaurant with Illinois and Willie Jackson. "I need information, everything about those 8 boys. Names, addresses, families, where they work, who they owe money to, what their parents do for a living. Everything." "You want us to grab them?" Willie asked. "No, I want you to investigate them. I want to know their lives inside and out, because I'm not going to touch them. I'm not going to threaten them. I'm going to destroy them without ever getting close enough to throw a punch." "Boss, I don't understand. They put Marcus in the hospital. Don't they deserve—" "They deserve worse than what I usually do," Bumpy interrupted. "They deserve to learn a lesson they'll never forget. And they're going to learn it. But Marcus is right. If I handle this the old way, he loses. He gets expelled. He loses his scholarship. He loses his future. And I'm not going to let 8 ignorant kids destroy my nephew's dreams." They were about to learn that Bumpy Johnson didn't always need violence to destroy his enemies. Sometimes the smartest revenge was the kind that looked like justice. Monday morning, Illinois Gordon walked into Bumpy's office with a thick folder. He'd been up all weekend gathering information. "Boss, I got everything. All 8 of them." Bumpy took the folder, started reading. What he found was better than he'd hoped for. Tommy Sullivan, 17, leader of the group. Father, Patrick Sullivan, dock worker at Pier 54. Mother, Mary Sullivan, works as a seamstress. Family lives in a rent-controlled apartment on 10th Avenue that they can barely afford. Tommy works part-time at his uncle's butcher shop to help with bills. Has 2 younger sisters, both in Catholic school, that costs $12 per month the family can barely scrape together. Patrick Kelly, 16, Tommy's best friend. Father died in a construction accident 2 years ago. Mother works 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night, working in a factory during the day. 3 younger brothers. Family is 1 month behind on rent, about to be evicted. The other 6 boys came from similar backgrounds. Working-class Irish families struggling to survive in Hell's Kitchen. Fathers who worked the docks or construction. Mothers who cleaned or sewed. Families living paycheck to paycheck, one disaster away from homelessness. And all 8 boys attended DeWitt Clinton High School, on scholarships provided by St. Michael's Church in Hell's Kitchen. That last detail made Bumpy smile. St. Michael's Church? They're paying for these boys to go to school?
Yeah, boss. Father Patrick O'Malley runs a scholarship fund for Irish kids from Hell's Kitchen. He raises money from the parish, pays for books, uniforms, subway fare. Without that money, none of these kids could afford to go to Clinton. They'd be working full-time instead of getting an education. Where does Father O'Malley get the money? Donations from the parish. But here's the interesting part. The church is behind on its own bills. The archdiocese threatened to close St. Michael's last year because they couldn't make their mortgage payment.
Father O'Malley somehow came up with $5,000 to save it, but nobody knows where he got the money.
Bumpy thought about that. Find out who holds the mortgage on St. Michael's Church. Already did. It's held by Hudson River Bank. Small bank on the west side. Irish-owned, serves mostly the immigrant community. Who owns Hudson River Bank? Majority shareholder is a man named Connor McBride. Irish immigrant, made his money in shipping, bought the bank 15 years ago. He's also on the board of directors at St. Michael's Church. So Connor McBride owns the bank that holds the mortgage on the church, and he's on the church's board. Interesting. What else do we know about McBride? Illinois flipped through his notes. He's got gambling debts, owes about $15,000 to some Italian bookies in Brooklyn. He's been paying it down slowly, but he's struggling. Word is the Italians are getting impatient. Who are the bookies? They work for the Gallo brothers, Joey and Larry Gallo. Bumpy knew the Gallos. Brooklyn operators. Ambitious, not particularly smart. The Gallos owe me a favor from last year. I helped Joey avoid a murder charge by providing an alibi witness. He said if I ever needed anything, to ask. What are you thinking, boss?
I'm thinking that we're going to solve everyone's problems. McBride gets out of his gambling debt. The Gallo brothers get their money. Father O'Malley's church gets financial security. And 8 boys who beat my nephew learn a very expensive lesson about consequences. How? Bumpy pulled out a piece of paper, started writing. First, call the Gallos. Tell them I want to buy McBride's debt. Offer them $18,000. That's the $15,000 he owes plus 20% interest. They'll take it because they're not getting paid anyway. Now McBride owes me instead of them.
Then what? Then I pay a visit to Connor McBride. I explain that I now own his debt, and I offer him a way out. He does exactly what I tell him for the next 2 weeks, and I forgive the entire $15,000. He refuses, and I call the debt immediately. He'll do what I say. What do you want him to do? I want him to foreclose on St. Michael's church mortgage. I want him to threaten to seize the church property unless Father O'Malley pays the full outstanding balance, which I'm guessing is more than the good father can come up with on short notice. Illinois was starting to see it. And when Father O'Malley can't pay, the church loses its scholarship fund money. The 8 boys lose their funding. They can't go to school anymore. Exactly. But we're not done yet. Once the boys lose their scholarships, I'm going to make Father O'Malley an offer. I'll pay off the church's mortgage completely, about $8,000 according to these records. In exchange, Father O'Malley does 3 things. First, he makes the 8 boys come to St. Michael's Church every Sunday for 6 months, and publicly apologize to Marcus and the congregation for what they did. Second, he makes them work 100 hours each of community service in Harlem, helping black families. Third, he writes a letter to DeWitt Clinton High School demanding better protection for minority students and threatening to pull all St. Michael's scholarship students if the school doesn't implement real consequences for racial violence.
"Boss, that's—" Illinois shook his head in admiration. "That's genius. You're not touching them. You're making the church punish them. You're making them apologize publicly, work in the community they hate, and you're changing school policy, all without throwing a single punch. And here's the beautiful part," Bumpy continued. "When it's over, when the boys have served their time and apologized and worked their hours, I'm going to restore their scholarships. I'm going to set up a fund that pays for all 8 of them to finish high school, because I want them to learn something more important than just punishment. I want them to learn that the black man they tried to destroy was powerful enough to ruin their lives, but merciful enough to give them a second chance. I want them to spend the rest of their lives knowing they owe their education to Bumpy Johnson. What if Father O'Malley refuses your offer? He won't, because the alternative is watching his church get seized by the bank, watching his scholarship fund disappear, watching 8 families lose hope. He's a good man. He'll do what's right. And what's right is making those boys face consequences. When do we start? Now. Call the gallows. Set up the debt purchase. Then arrange a meeting with Connor McBride for tomorrow morning. And, Illinois, make sure word gets around Harlem about what happened to Marcus. I want our people to see how I handle this. I want them to see that you don't always need violence to get justice." Tuesday morning, Bumpy sat in Connor McBride's office at Hudson River Bank. McBride was a nervous man in his 50s, thinning hair, expensive suit that didn't quite hide his anxiety. "Mr. Johnson, I'm not sure why you wanted to meet." "I'll make it simple, Connor. I bought your gambling debt from the Gallo brothers. You now owe me $15,000. I can call that debt right now, which would bankrupt you and probably cost you this bank. Or you can do exactly what I tell you for the next 2 weeks, and I'll forgive the entire debt. Your choice." McBride's face went pale. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to call the mortgage on St. Michael's Church. Tell Father O'Malley he has 2 weeks to pay the outstanding $8,000, or you'll foreclose." "I can't do that. Father O'Malley is a good man. That church is all those people have." "I know. That's exactly why you're going to do it. Because in 2 weeks, I'm going to solve Father O'Malley's problem. But first, he needs to have a problem to solve. You're going to create that problem." McBride made the call that afternoon. Father Patrick O'Malley received the notice on Wednesday morning. The church had 14 days to pay $8,000 or lose the building. Father O'Malley spent Wednesday and Thursday desperately trying to raise the money. He called the archdiocese. They had nothing to give. He called wealthy parishioners. They were struggling themselves. He called every connection he had. By Friday, he'd raised $1,200. He needed $6,800 more. It was impossible. On Friday afternoon, Father O'Malley was sitting in his church office, head in his hands, when there was a knock on the door. "Come in." Bumpy Johnson walked in, dressed in a black suit, fedora in hand. "Father O'Malley? My name is Bumpy Johnson. I'd like to talk to you about your church's financial difficulties." The priest looked up, recognized the name immediately. Everyone in New York knew Bumpy Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think—" "Please, Father, just 5 minutes of your time." The priest gestured to a chair. Bumpy sat, got straight to the point. "I understand the bank is foreclosing on your mortgage.
$8,000 in 10 days, or you lose the church." The priest's face went white. "My God, I heard about an incident, but I didn't know. Which boys?" "Tommy Sullivan, Patrick Kelly, and 6 others, all on your scholarship program, all getting their education paid for by this church. And they used that privilege to put a child in the hospital." Father O'Malley put his head in his hands. "Sweet Jesus, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I'd known—" "I know you didn't know, Father. You're a good man, trying to help these boys escape poverty through education. But now 8 of them have learned the wrong lesson. They've learned that violence has no consequences, and I can't let that stand." "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to pull their scholarships immediately. I want you to call their families and explain that because of what they did, the church can no longer fund their education. Let them face the consequences of their actions. Mr. Johnson, if I do that, those boys won't finish high school. They'll end up on the docks or worse. Their futures will be destroyed." "I know. That's why, after they've faced consequences, after they've learned their lesson, I'm going to restore their funding. But not through the church. Through a fund I'm going to set up. Here's what I want, Father. I pay off your mortgage, $8,000. The church is yours free and clear. In exchange, you do 5 things." "What 5 things?" 1. You make all 8 boys come to this church every Sunday for 6 months and publicly apologize to my nephew Marcus in front of the entire congregation. 2. You make them work 100 hours each of community service in Harlem, not here in Hell's Kitchen, in Harlem, helping black families, learning that we're human beings deserving of respect. 3. You write a letter to DeWitt Clinton High School demanding they implement real consequences for racial violence and better protection for minority students. 4. You give a sermon about racial hatred and why it has no place in Christian teaching. And 5. After they've completed all of that, after they've served their time and learned their lesson, you accept my donation to fund their continued education. I'll pay for all 8 to finish high school, because I want them to understand something." "What's that?" "That the black man they tried to destroy was powerful enough to ruin their lives, but merciful enough to give them a second chance. I want them to go to sleep every night knowing they owe their future to Bumpy Johnson. That's a lesson they'll never forget. And maybe, just maybe, they'll teach their children not to hate people because of the color of their skin." Father O'Malley was quiet for a long moment. "You're a complicated man, Mr. Johnson." "I'm a man who protects his family, Father. And I'm a man who believes in education. My nephew wants to be a lawyer someday. He wants to change the world through books and knowledge, not through violence. I won't let 8 ignorant kids destroy that dream. But I also won't become what they think I am. I won't be the violent black criminal they expect. I'll be the man who taught them justice without throwing a single punch." "When do you want this to start?" "The boys lose their scholarships Monday. First public apology is next Sunday. Community service starts the following week. The letter to the school goes out Monday. Your sermon on racial hatred is this Sunday. I want the whole parish to hear it, including the 8 boys and their families. And, Father, I'll be in the congregation. I want to see their faces when they realize who paid to save their church and who's giving them a second chance." Father O'Malley extended his hand. "You have my word, Mr. Johnson. All 5 things will happen exactly as you asked. And thank you. You're saving more than just the church. You're saving those boys from becoming the men they were headed toward becoming."
That's the goal, Father. That's always been the goal.
Tommy's face went red. His father stood up. "What? Tommy, is this true?" "He didn't belong there, Da. He was taking spots from our own." Patrick Sullivan's hand cracked across his son's face, hard. "Don't you dare. Don't you ever dare use that excuse in my house. I didn't raise you to be a thug." He turned to Father O'Malley. "What happened to the boy? Is he all right?" "He'll recover, but there are consequences. The church scholarship fund has been suspended. Tommy and the 7 other boys involved can no longer receive funding for their education, effective immediately."
"Father, please," Patrick begged. "We can't afford to send Tommy to school without that scholarship. He'll have to quit. He'll end up on the docks like me. No education, no future." "I know, Patrick, and I'm sorry, but actions have consequences. Your son participated in a brutal attack on a child. The church cannot fund that behavior." Tommy's mother, Mary, started crying. His 2 younger sisters, who'd been listening from their bedroom, came out. "Tommy can't go to school anymore?" the youngest asked. The apartment fell into devastated silence. This scene repeated in 7 other Hell's Kitchen apartments that Monday morning. 8 families learning that their sons' futures had just disappeared because of violence and hatred. Sunday, October 30th, 1949. St. Michael's Church was packed. Every pew filled. The 8 boys and their families sat in the front rows, as Father O'Malley had requested. They didn't know why, didn't know what was happening. They just knew the priest had said their presence was mandatory. Marcus Johnson sat in the 3rd row with his mother Margaret and his uncle Bumpy. His ribs still hurt, but the doctor had cleared him to leave the house. His right hand was still in a cast. His new glasses, paid for by Uncle Bumpy, sat on his face. He looked nervous. Father O'Malley paused. Let that sink in. "Now, I want the 8 boys who did this to stand up." Slowly, shamefully, Tommy Sullivan and his 7 friends stood. Their families looked mortified. "You see these 8 boys? They're good kids from good families, hard-working families, families that have struggled and sacrificed to give their sons opportunities. And what did these boys do with those opportunities? They used them to hurt someone weaker than themselves. They used them to spread hatred and violence." As of last Monday, all 8 of these boys lost their church scholarships. They can no longer afford to attend DeWitt Clinton High School. Their futures, their dreams, everything their families worked for, gone. Because they made a choice. They chose violence over compassion. They chose hatred over humanity. And now they're paying the price. Mothers were crying now. Fathers had their heads down. But I want to tell you something about Marcus Johnson. More specifically, about his uncle, Bumpy Johnson. Every head in the church turned to look at Bumpy. He sat still, face showing nothing. Mr. Johnson had every right to respond to this attack with violence, every right to seek revenge. That's what many of you expected, isn't it? That's what 8 boys and their families have been terrified of for 2 weeks, waiting for Bumpy Johnson to come for them.
But do you know what Mr. Johnson did instead? He saved our church. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Our mortgage was being foreclosed. We had 10 days to pay $8,000 or lose this building. I had no way to raise that money. We were finished. And then Bumpy Johnson walked into my office and offered to pay the entire mortgage, free and clear. This church now owns this building because a black man, the uncle of the boy you tried to destroy, chose mercy over vengeance, chose to save the very community that produced his nephew's attackers. People were openly weeping now. But Mr. Johnson's mercy comes with conditions. Tommy Sullivan, Patrick Kelly, Sean O'Brien, Michael Donovan, Jimmy Ryan, Danny Murphy, Kevin Walsh, and Brendan Fitzgerald, you will now approach Marcus Johnson and apologize, publicly, in front of this entire congregation, and you will do this every Sunday for the next 6 months. The 8 boys looked at each other. Tommy Sullivan stepped forward first, walked to where Marcus was standing. He couldn't meet Marcus's eyes. I'm sorry. What I did was wrong. You didn't deserve it. None of it. One by one, the other 7 followed. Some cried. Some could barely get the words out. Marcus stood there, 14 years old, listening to boys 3 and 4 years older than him apologize for trying to break him. When the 8th boy finished, Father O'Malley continued. These 8 boys will also complete 100 hours each of community service in Harlem. They will work with black families. They will learn that the people they hated are human beings deserving of respect and dignity. They will do this every Saturday for the next 6 months. And finally, after they have completed their apologies and their service, after they have learned their lesson and shown genuine change, Mr. Johnson has agreed to fund their education. All 8 boys will have their scholarships restored. Not through the church, through a fund Mr. Johnson is creating. He will pay for them to finish high school. Because Mr. Johnson believes in education. He believes in second chances. He believes that even boys who make terrible mistakes can learn to be better men. The church erupted. People standing, turning to look at Bumpy. Some were crying with gratitude. Some looked ashamed. Tommy Sullivan's father stood, walked to where Bumpy was sitting, dropped to his knees. Mr. Johnson, my son, I don't know what to say. Teach him, Bumpy said quietly. Teach him that hatred destroys everything. Teach him that skin color doesn't determine worth. Teach him that the world is changing, and he can either change with it or be left behind. That's all I ask. After the service, people lined up to thank Bumpy, to shake his hand, to apologize for their children, for their community, for the hatred that had hurt Marcus. Bumpy accepted each apology with grace, with dignity. When the church finally emptied, only Bumpy, Marcus, and Father O'Malley remained. Uncle Bumpy, Marcus said quietly, why did you do all this? Why didn't you just, handle it the way you usually handle things? Because you're going to be a lawyer someday, Marcus. You're going to change the world through education and justice. And I couldn't let you see your uncle solve problems the old way. I needed to show you that there's a better path. That intelligence and strategy and, yes, even mercy can be more powerful than violence.
6 months later, in April 1950, the 8 boys completed their community service. They'd worked in soup kitchens in Harlem, helped repair homes, tutored younger kids. They'd met families, heard stories, learned that the people they'd been taught to hate were just people, struggling like their own families, working hard like their own parents, wanting better for their children like everyone wants. Tommy Sullivan wrote Bumpy a letter on the last day of service. "Mr. Johnson, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't forgive myself. But I want you to know that these 6 months changed my life. I've met people I would never have met. I've learned things I was never taught.
And I understand now that what I did to Marcus wasn't just wrong, it was evil. I spent my whole life being told that black people were different, inferior, dangerous. But working in Harlem, I've learned that we're all the same. We all want safety, opportunity, respect. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance you gave me. Thank you. Tommy Sullivan." Bumpy showed the letter to Marcus, who was back at DeWitt Clinton High School, getting straight A's, still on track for Columbia. "What do you think?" Bumpy asked. "I think people can change," Marcus said. "I think you showed them a better way. I think you won without throwing a single punch." "That was the point. Violence is easy, Marcus. Anyone can hurt someone. But teaching people, changing hearts, that's hard. That's the real power." "Is that why you became what you are? To protect people? To change things?" "I became what I am because the world didn't give me other choices. But you, Marcus, you have choices. You can become a lawyer. You can change laws, fight injustice, protect people the right way. You can be what I never got to be. And that's why I did all of this. Not just to teach those 8 boys, to show you that there are multiple paths to justice." 10 years later, in 1959, Marcus Johnson graduated from Columbia Law School, second in his class. He became a civil rights attorney, worked on desegregation cases, defended activists, changed laws. And in his office, for his entire career, he kept 2 things framed on his wall: the letter from Columbia offering him a scholarship when he was 14, and Tommy Sullivan's apology letter, reminders of the day his Uncle Bumpy taught him that the most powerful weapon isn't a gun. It's the courage to choose mercy over vengeance, education over violence, strategy over rage. Tommy Sullivan graduated high school in 1951. Went to City College on another scholarship Bumpy quietly funded. Became a teacher. Spent 40 years teaching in integrated schools in New York, fighting against the same hatred he'd once embodied. Every year on October 14th, the anniversary of the attack, he donated money to scholarships for minority students. His way of paying back a debt he knew could never be fully repaid. The other 7 boys followed similar paths. Some became teachers. Some became tradesmen who hired diverse crews. Some became fathers who taught their children that hatred was a poison that destroyed the hater as much as the hated. All 8 of them knew they owed their second chance to a man they'd been taught to fear, a man who'd shown them mercy when he had every right to show them violence. And in Harlem, the story became legend. The story of how Bumpy Johnson destroyed 8 boys' futures without throwing a single punch, then rebuilt those futures to prove a point. The story of how he saved a church to teach a lesson.
The story of how he turned enemies into allies through strategy and mercy. People told their children. Those children told their children. It became part of Harlem's oral history. Proof that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a protector, a strategist, a man who understood that real power isn't about how many people you can hurt. It's about how many people you can save, even when they don't deserve it. Especially when they don't deserve it. That's the story they still tell in Harlem. The story of 8 white teenagers who beat a black boy and learned that vengeance isn't always violent. Sometimes it's intelligent. Sometimes it's merciful. And sometimes it changes everyone involved for the better.